Well, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to dig into this panel. My name is Grace, and I'm a reporter at Fast Company, specializing in design coverage. I'm also a bit of a resident office Gen Zer, so I'll be bringing some of that perspective to this panel. Today we're going to be unpacking a question that I think probably a lot of us have pondered in recent months, which is, why are we still talking about return to office in 2025? And I want to acknowledge we might all be maybe a little tired, even annoyed of still discussing this topic so many years after the beginning of the pandemic. But I'd actually argue that it's even more relevant now than it has been ever before. And I'll tell you why I think that. So to set the scene on where we are in the return to office saga right now, in a January resume builder survey, 9 out of 10 companies actually reported that they would require workers back in office sometime this year. And additionally, last year, a KPMG survey found that actually 79% of CEOs believed workers would be back in office 5 days a week within 3 years, which was a major jump from what they reported the previous year in 2023. We're also seeing lots of companies come into 2025 with stricter RTO policies like Amazon, AT&T, JP Morgan, the Washington Post, so sort of across a lot of industries. And just based on that anecdotal evidence, I think it's clear that we're at a moment where the return to office pendulum is sort of swinging back in this direction of trying to return the office to how it was pre-pandemic. But I speak for myself, and I think probably a lot of other employees when I say that working from home during the pandemic and maybe shifting to a hybrid schedule in the years following sort of represented a fundamental shift in how we all think about the ways that we work, whether that be flexibility, to take care of kids, and to that point, how we balance work and life, and then also just how we interact with colleagues. I'm sure a lot of you have become way more familiar with Zoom, Slack, Microsoft Teams as sort of these main modes that you're using to communicate with colleagues when you're not in the same room. So a bit of a confession, and case in point, I am a 100% remote employee. That's actually why I'm able to join you guys today when my company is based in New York City. And again, I'm a Gen Zer, so I graduated college and sort of immediately moved into this mode of work. And I think that's a small anecdote that points to a larger reality we shouldn't ignore, which is that a large percentage of our incoming workforce is probably even more familiar with these remote or hybrid work modes than they are with how we might imagine like a traditional office setting. So as we move into our panel today, I want us to ask ourselves not just how to return to the office of the past, but maybe to use this as an opportunity to reimagine what the office of the future might look like. And not even just the office as a physical space, but work in general as a concept, because I think this doesn't only apply to the actual office itself. So that is a really big question, but we have 3 lovely panelists here today who can speak to this from a number of points of view. So we have Megan DeTrotto. She's Director of Workforce Strategy at the consultancy firm Design Force. Megan leads talent acquisition for organizations in the building, interior design, and architecture industries. So she's sort of watching these conversations play out in real time between employers and employees. We have Amanda Schneider. Amanda is president and founder of ThinkLab, the research division of Interior Design Magazine. And she also hosts a podcast called Design Nerds Anonymous, repping with the hat. And so Amanda has done extensive research into how the way we work is changing, with a special recent focus on the way that Gen Z is thinking about work today. And finally, we have Lee Pasteris. Lee is design principal at Gensler in LA. She's worked with amazing clients like DreamWorks, Sony, and Lionsgate on their interiors. So Lee can give us a perspective of how clients are currently thinking about actually reimagining their spaces themselves. All right, so to kick it off, I kind of want to turn the concept of this panel back on my panelists and ask, from your points of view, why is this RTO conversation still relevant in 2025? What kinds of conversations are you hearing from clients, employees, employers that make you think this is still relevant?
Who wants to start?
I'll kick it off.
Okay,
great.
Hello, everyone. So great to be here. And thank you for that, Grace.
Yeah, of course.
Knowing I was going to be on this panel for the last 6 to 8 weeks, it's been interesting, especially interacting with new clients. And it's a broad spectrum from nonprofit to a sports team to a talent agency. And people are still asking, what's the solution about getting people back to the office, even if their policies are 5 days a week with some flexibility. It's still, they're looking for the answers of what the solution should be for them. I also mentioned it to a couple different people in leadership positions, and they were quite frankly annoyed with me. They're like, you shouldn't have a title like that for a discussion, because their philosophy is everyone should be back. Everyone should be participating in the office. That's where you learn, that's where you innovate. So it's really interesting, from leadership positions to staff and employees, what is the solution? So we're always trying to find the right balance to draw people into the office, because it still is a question.
How do you handle those conversations when there's sort of this attitude that return to office is the only way? Do you have any examples?
Well, yeah, people can look at their productivity. You can look at the data, right, and see, as a design firm, are you innovative? Are you coming up with those ideas? Like my husband was saying, yeah, did you hear what Jamie Dimon said from JP Morgan? You're not going to learn working in your basement at home. You're going to be learning in the office, interacting, collaborating. That's where the magic happens. And that's what we're hearing over and over again. But the question is, what is that solution, to have that kind of a workplace?
Yeah, go ahead, Amanda.
Okay. When I think about this question, like, why are we still talking about RTO? I think one of the first points I want to make is, in some ways, I think we're asking the wrong questions. And I am also a remote employee, and don't take that as physical space is not important. I think, ironically, as we're more freed up from a set work location, it makes that physical space wildly more important. But if you look at some research by the Future Forum, it shows that actually it's more important to individuals when they work than where they work. And if you think about it, I am a morning person. I love my 4 a.m. work time or workout time. I'm guessing many of you do not agree with that. But I think as we look, one of the things that I'll say definitely to support, what Leah was saying is, I think that there's a trust gap building. And I think it's getting bigger. And some want to blame hybrid work. That could be true. I can't say what it's a cause of. But I want to just kind of run through, I have my notes in front of me so I get these right, but just kind of 5 reasons that I think this trust gap is growing. One, I think that hybrid work has upended the old playbook that we used to live by. I think if you were to write out, let's say, 5, 10 rules that the old world of work was built upon, some of them don't necessarily apply now that we've been through this extreme that we've been through in the last 5 years. Technology is racing ahead, but culture is lagging behind. I think this is especially true of our physical built environment because we have to build a physical space. That takes time to design, it takes time to build, it takes investment, and once it's done, it's a physical thing that you then have to change. So technology can move quickly, but our culture is much more slow to adapt. The third one is multiple generations are now navigating the same workplace with entirely different mental operating systems. I just recently did a TED Talk that is titled "Work is Broken. Gen Z can help us fix it." Also triggering, so happy to talk to you about that later because there's nuance to that. Don't just read the title, you have to listen to the whole talk. The fourth one is geography is no longer a boundary. For the first time in history, technology is enabling this instant collaboration. So it's not just about going back to your local office, but it's how your local office collaborates with Mumbai and Japan and wherever else your offices are. And finally, work is no longer confined to time or place. How many of you say you work 8 to 5? How many of you feel you actually do work 8 to 5? Anybody put it down at 5 o'clock anymore? Probably not many of us.
No.
So I think what we're looking at is that work has really shifted and our culture and kind of physical workplaces just need a moment to catch up, and we're in this odd kind of interim here. So I don't know what you'd add to that.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points, and I think I have a different perspective, or I see things through a little bit of a different lens because I don't design physical spaces. We help design organizations, and the reason why we're still talking about this is because the pendulum has been swinging back and forth so rapidly, and there's so many different generations and so many different trains of thought around like, what does community in the workplace mean? How do we define that? There's no one size fits all answer, right? I think that's the beauty of design, is that we're always trying to solve that for different organizations. And at the end of the day, return to office is a people issue, right? It's a human issue that disproportionately affects women and minorities. 20% of women and minorities are impacted as to 7% of men by their jobs being required to be back in office. I think that it disproportionately impacts senior and skilled workers. I think that there's a lot of things that we have really raced to the altar with in terms of solutions and not thought about the reverberations or other impacts that it can have, because the consensus is that, one, over 90% of employees in the workforce in the US want to be together, right? They also want to have flexibility. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of firms listening to, I think, outside influencers around what that means and how to do that, and not necessarily giving their organization a voice in that. And that was talked a little bit about at the inclusive design panel earlier, but I think that's why we're still talking about it, right? Because it's a complex problem that's compounded by a number of generations, a number of modalities. We also have, like you said, so many modalities to work and what that means, and it's unique.
Yeah. So Megan, you work in talent acquisition, and I'm curious how common it is to see employees actually turn down a job offer because they're not comfortable with the return to office policy of the company.
I think that, offer rejections is a really interesting statistic to look at it through, because from a talent acquisition perspective, a lot more of that rejection of opportunity happens long before you get to an offer, right? So we represent a whole bunch of different types of firms and different scales and sizes across the United States. And if we're talking statistically, like it's pretty substantial very early in the process that people are saying, absolutely not, I need this, this is what my requirements are, and I can't even consider opportunities that require 4 and 5 days a week. Or conversely, they're like, I really want to be in the office. Where is there a culture that exists where I can participate in that? So I don't think it's happening so much. Like if you're an organization looking at offer rejected, I would challenge you to dig in a lot deeper into the data that's happening within your organization, because if you're waiting until offer to be evaluating that, you're waiting way too long.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Because I'm curious about this too. What about like leaving companies? These companies that are calling people back to the office and mandates. Are you seeing people exit for that, or not aligning with maybe the shift that's happened over the last 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly seeing a pretty substantial spike in attrition when companies are implementing return to office policies. I think you can plug that question into whatever Google search or AI tool that you use and get some statistics that vary slightly, but I think it's something like, firms on average are seeing it spike to something above 20% in attrition after implementation or post-implementation, and maintaining maybe like a 13 to 14% higher attrition rate after implementing those policies. But then, data is really interesting because there's 3 sides to every story, and I think you can shape a narrative around whichever statistic you want. But it is impacting. But I think a lot of it is, sometimes people, it can be a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction. And we still live in a world where people have choice, right? It's an employee-driven marketplace. Talent has options and flexibility and choices, and they're choosing firms that, maybe they wouldn't have chosen as a destination previously for certain criteria. But if flexibility is really important to that individual, they're looking at things and evaluating opportunities differently these days. So yeah, high attrition, but I think it starts to level out and works itself out.
Right. So you note this attrition trend, and also you brought up sort of the trust gap. Big question maybe for you, Amanda, but I'm curious what you think the most important thing that executives or companies need to know right now that maybe they're missing when we are running into all of this seemingly almost universal tension between employers and employees and how they view the RTO debate.
I think it's really interesting, and I want to bring in a stat from McCrindle. If you haven't heard of McCrindle, they're one of the leading generational research companies. And I came across a really interesting perspective that talks about what different generations value in leadership. Now, this is not necessarily universally true. This is some of the problem with generational research, is it kind of stereotypes people. But one of them said, or the stat from McCrindle says, baby boomers tend to value leadership that directs. Gen X looks for leaders who coordinate. Millennials prefer leaders who guide. And Gen Z expects leadership to empower. And I feel like that empower word has come up a lot in our Gen Z research. This kind of, I trust you if you trust me. And if you look at the demographic that a lot of these RTO mandates are coming from, it is definitely leaders who probably direct, right? So that is a sign of respect for them. They're intending to be positive in that. They're never, no one's ever intending to create friction in a negative way. But if you kind of extend that out a little bit more, McCrindle is doing research on Gen Alpha, who is not even in the workforce yet, but will be around 10, 11% of the workforce by 2030. So that's pretty alarming. And Gen Alpha is expecting leadership that inspires. So we're in the middle of this kind of big shift from leadership that directs and coordinates to leadership that guides, empowers, and inspires. And I think that's part of the cultural shift that we're in right now, is figuring out how to make that shift. And, I am a Gen Xer. We were raised on the golden rule. You all can say it with me: treat others the way
you want to be treated.
You want to be treated. But I think in today's era, sometimes that is not always respectful, right? We want to be treated not the way you want to be treated, but the way we all want to be treated. A story I tell often is my 10-year-old son loves Pokemon. We ask him, what should we get Dad for his birthday? Guess what he says? Pokemon. Do you think that's a great gift for my Army Ranger husband? Not so much. So this is a good example of what we're calling the platinum rule. Treat others the way they want to be treated, not the way you want to be treated. But I think that's an interesting one. And Lee, I'd love to hear your talk on this, because you have to take all these individual requirements. We cannot possibly make one physical space that meets the need of every individual that occupies that space. I'd love to hear how you navigate some of that.
Yeah, and it's, when we interact with clients, they know design matters, the design experience, and I think some of that narrative needs to switch around. Maybe staff is more about a consumer experience, thinking about what the day in the life of an employee is, how they navigate the space. And I think that's why we are so proactive about co-creating with the client and collaborating with them all along the process, so that they understand what it takes and we understand them. We don't come in with preconceived ideas. It's all created depending on who this company is, the culture, and what that end product is. And along the way, what's so important is kind of the education and teaching people the reason why. I think a lot of people just come in and accept potentially what their workspace is, so this is what it is. But if you teach them along the way the reasons why, the plans are the plans, the amenities are the amenities, and the reason why. We finished headquarters for a global financial firm, and it had a different mindset. It's about, you don't come to work to sit, you come and move. There are interconnecting stairs that create opportunities to people to move around. And by the stairs, there's lounges, and those lounges are curated in very different styles on all the levels. So you get a different experience if you wanted to go to the library or the cabana or the art gallery. And each of those floors have a beverage of choice too. So you start getting different environments for different people, and people want to experience that. And not only was those lounges curated, but there were 18 different collaboration rooms we did. And it's based in LA, so it was all about LA neighborhoods. I want to be in the Arts District today, or now I'm going to go to the West Side with the view to Marina del Rey. So the physical environments help support those spaces. Or I want to go in the Hollywood Griffith Park. So it sets the tone for the meeting. Technologies are similar in every room, but the design experience is very different about the physical furniture, the finishes, the lighting.
Yeah.
So it all has different properties. And not to mention there's a fitness center, but that's almost kind of a given, right? That's kind of the baseline and expected in a lot of companies, but it's the physical workspace that makes a difference in how people are experiencing interacting into those spaces. We're also doing, construction's just starting on a rooftop amenity too. So there's more moving. There's a pickleball court, the golf simulator, opportunities to sit outside, in the Southern California climate. It all makes a difference, to be able to experience those kind of environments in a day. And then, it's not 8 hours, it's 10 hours, it's 12 hours, and then you're productive, right? You're coming back, you're enjoying the work you did and engaging in that meeting. But all these spaces help support you, during that daytime period.
Yeah. Maybe this ties into that example you just shared, but are there any trends you're noticing in terms of how offices are actually changing their setup in order to sort of, I don't want to say lure, but kind of lure employees back into
they're
the
luring,
workspace?
yeah, they're totally pulling in the line. And one client was interesting because, they said, what keeps you up at night? We love asking that question, right? Because there's always issues and concerns. And it's not so much, the budget, the schedule. No, it's about my biggest competitor is home. So how do I make these spaces work for them? And some of the solutions were for this particular client and space. There's curated amenities again, and there's a boardroom, where you have a large physical space that you may only use 4 times a month, or even sometimes 4 times a year, depending. And we made it into a library. So it has a long table when it needs to be a long table. It can break apart, but there's a curated library from the staff. There's different types of seating. So in that downtime, so to speak, there's opportunities to use the space differently. But again, you have to inform the employees how to use these spaces. They also had like a lounge, kind of a barista setup, and the client was meeting with one of his clients, and a staff opened the door and was like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. And they're like, no, please come in. That's the purpose of this space, for you to enjoy it, for me to have a meeting with my colleagues, so that we're seeing each other. It's not silos, right? It's the shared space. So the behavior of work is changing, and how the space is influencing that will change that behavior.
Yeah, and can I add to that?
Sure,
Because I actually
of
love that
course.
you use the word lure. I think it's an important word, because we are trying to lure people in a good way. Like, I think your apology was maybe like it's a negative thing, but I think that there's something in addition to all these amazing amenities and spaces and kind of the flies that the honey that we're missing when we look at some of these generational and communication pieces. So one of our Think Lab stats says that 78% of Gen Z feels that they can work totally remotely and never meet anyone and be just fine with it. But they also say that 86% of them, the way that they learn best, the way that they forge personal connections, is face to face.
Yeah.
But I want you to think back to the feeling of the junior high cafeteria. Anybody have a good response right now? No. You've got this like weird feeling in your gut, like a little uncomfortable. So there's another great book and a podcast, an amazing human that did a TEDx talk called Hannah Grady Williams. And she has this theory that people 35 and older are analog natives, digital second, right? We naturally think in the physical world and then the digital world, right? But one of the most shocking things to us was really when we look at some of our younger generations is how blind they are to their physical digital fluidity.
Yeah.
And Hannah says people under 30 are naturally digital first, analog second. And for those of you in the 30 to 35 range, you're like, what about me? she didn't forget you. It just depends on your parents and how you're raised. But I think we have to think about that mindset. I think about my kids. I have 2 Gen Zs and a Gen Alpha. My kids, they don't walk to the park to see who's there. They're going to text their friends and see if they can find them, or they're going to find them in Roblox or Minecraft, and then they're going to figure out a physical place to meet up. So I think something that we're missing as we think about luring people back in with all the great amenities, and I want to go to that cabana, that sounds fabulous.
It is.
Is also, I hope there's a pineapple drink or something, but I think it's also how we communicate, right? Because some of these digital natives, we need to build relationships with them digitally so that they want to show up in person. And an example that I share that's like super, super simple is something like a photo on an email signature. Because it digitally lets them know who you are and what it looks like. And if you think about that, that's the digital equivalent of walking into that cafeteria. Now I see Grace and I know, oh gosh, I know her face. That's definitely her. I'm not sure if that was, I'm not sure if that was you or not because I haven't seen your face. It's a way to kind of connect them digitally that makes them feel much more comfortable and much less like that junior high cafeteria scenario coming in.
Yeah. I think something I would add is, we're talking a lot about physical space, and I think I hear a lot about all the design and the ways that people are using the spaces. But one of the things that I would say, or, we talk to CEOs or leaders of firms about when they think about returning to office and how to build their organization around that. I think, one, obviously the space has to be absolutely magnetic to draw them in, right? So your amenities rich, it's purpose-filled, right? Creating opportunities for interaction. But I think what organizations tend to forget or sort of lose sight of is you can also design those opportunities for interaction very intentionally, right? And so one of the things that we hear a lot is, the grumble and mumble about return to work or return to office is, well, I'm in the office 3 days a week, but the people that I want to learn from are never there with me. Or there's not opportunities there in the right ways, right? Like this person that I just, talk about magnetic, like all of us have those people in our organizations where we're like, oh my God, I just want to sit across from this person because I love the way they talk. I want to, emulation is the biggest compliment. And if those opportunities aren't there, like gone are the days of beer 30, right? Like nobody cares about that anymore. People are ambitious. They want to do things. They want to get back to being together and feeling connected. And it's not all about a social construct. It's about opportunities for growth. It's about how are you helping me grow and advance my career opportunity and what's in it for me, right? What's the motivator beyond just a really beautiful space that I can go hang out in? Because I think a lot of firms are competing for that. So again, like what I would sit down and talk to a CEO about is do exactly what you're doing, Lee, and sit and create this beautifully magnetic opportunity for physical space. But please make sure that you're being just as intentional about organizational design and growth opportunities and what connectedness looks like within your organization, because you have just as much control over that type of design as you do over physical space design.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Megan. I think that's really well said. We do a lot of work with tech media companies, and in the past, most of my work is LA-based, just from that framework. And the entertainment industry has been such a powerful force in Los Angeles. And it's those ethos and the culture of those companies that came from the main studio days to now tech media. And it's really about it starts with the culture of that company, right? That draws it in. And then the space helps support what that culture is and reinforces it.
Yeah, there's
and
so
that's
much
that's the beauty of developing, co-creating with a client.
Yeah, and what goes into like a destination firm, right?
Yes.
Like destination is about experience and so many facets of that.
It's about experience, and it's also about teaching the individuals, about their brand, right? And how that brand, what draws them to that work in the first place, and how that brand is supported and displayed, physically, but also, as part of their culture.
Yeah, and so you talked a little bit about like designing the spaces and then teaching people how to use those spaces, right? Like here's the purpose of this space and here's how you interact with it and here's how you get the most out of it. And I think workplace culture can be very much the same, right? So you think about creating these opportunities for connection, but it's like we're also creatures of habit, right? So there's people in the office that you tend to gravitate towards or that you like and maybe are less intimidated by, and then there's other people where for whatever reason, we all have it, right? We're all human, where you just are like, ooh, I don't have the courage today, or I'm not sure how to interact with this person, or this is really difficult, or it's outside of my comfort zone. I think organizations can also be really intentional about creating an infrastructure, but making it welcoming, or dismantling taboos around growth in the right ways and teaching people how to interact with each other so that they can grow and they can accelerate their opportunities. And I think that's really like, it has to go hand in hand. You can spend all kinds of money in creating a beautiful, beautiful physical space, and it may be magnetic for social reasons, but it's not going to accelerate your organization's productivity. It's not going to accelerate your organization's growth. It may, but I think those two things need to be sort of symbiotic to one another.
Yeah, it has to function to support what the work product is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because an engaged workforce is a productive workforce.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And I think the word that comes to mind for me is intentionality.
Absolutely.
And I think whether we're talking about a physical workplace or we're talking about the workforce, I think really taking time to define some of those rules for the future.
Yeah.
I think we've had hundreds of years to develop a work culture that was only in a physical workplace. And this hybrid world is very, very new. If you follow, some of the fully remote first cultures like GitHub, and a lot of them really start with manuals that intentionally say, this is what our culture is, and I think a good example of that is, if we were around a boardroom table, it might be very rude for me to talk to Grace while Megan's making a point, right? But in the Zoom world, we always start our focus groups that we do virtually by saying, it is okay to talk while someone's speaking. We don't want you to lose your thoughts, so just put it in the chat and we'll address it in a minute. And it's a way that we can kind of stay engaged on multiple levels. We're resetting manners and what that looks like. So for anyone who has not really explored what that looks like, a really great resource is a book called How the Future Works. It is written by Brian Elliott, Sheila Subramanian, Helen Krupp, and it's got a lot of tools around team-level agreements. So whether you're fully in office, whether you're fully remote or somewhere in between, it really brings that intentionality and some tools to kind of redefine what manners look like today, because things are shifting as our digital world emerges, as we're communicating across cultures and generations and lots of other things.
I'm curious, you mentioned earlier that sort of the standards for mentorship are shifting a little bit. Have you seen any examples of how companies are trying to move that more toward the digital world as opposed to we have to be face-to-face in person? Because like you said, Gen Z might not necessarily be used to that as much as other generations.
I love that you brought up mentorship, because I think this is a really important one as we talk about this hybrid spectrum and this return to work spectrum. Because we're doing a lot of research around Gen Z. We actually have a Gen Z cohort. So this was modeled after Gucci. Gucci recognized that its sales were declining as its core demographic was aging. And so they put in a next-gen cohort into they called it a shadow board, to advise their leadership on sales, marketing, and product development initiatives. And over the 2-year period this panel was in place, the result was 136% sales growth. Wow. During the same time period, their closest competitor declined 11.5%.
Wow.
So we have one in place specifically for the interiors industry, where we're kind of studying what happens there, and we just came out of a session around mentorship. And what we're hearing from them around mentorship is they say we have to be back in the office, but we get there, just like what Megan said, we get there and nobody's there, right? We're hearing quotes like, of course we have to be back in the office because we haven't reframed anything for this digital world that we're in, and so the only way we can learn is if we're in the office. But what they really want, and we actually had them tell stories about successful mentorship, what did that look like? And what that looked like for them was just as often remote, a mentor that was not physically face-to-face in that same office. It looked like maybe a champion that wasn't even necessarily within their company. They want to learn from people in the physical environment. They definitely learn from them. But again, if you think about these digitally native generations, they have lived in a world where they can look anything up online first before they ask a real human. Think about it. My kids would rather learn to tie their shoes from YouTube. They can fast forward, rewind, pause, do it again, My husband's an Army Ranger. You cannot do that with him. So YouTube is a much easier way for them to kind of learn one of these skills. And in every other area of their lives, they can reference things digitally so that they don't look stupid when asking a question to a real person. And so in a lot of our apprenticeship-driven worlds, and it's true for the interiors industry in a lot of ways, but it's true for a lot of other industry too, until we reframe so some of these things can be referenced a little bit more easily. A lot of them feel like they have to be in person, but I think what we're hearing from them is, it's really a good time to maybe rethink change, and really a good time to think, like, how might mentorship look a little bit differently if it involved maybe more digitization, yes, some in-person face-to-face, but again, thinking about bridging those relationships that may not always be a formal in-person session.
I also wanted to comment a little bit, because we have a robust mentorship and coaching program too, and it's in person. It's kind of mandatory that you're in person, and it's developing a relationship, right, with an individual. And in the design industry, it's a lot, I always think about it kind of, we're a teaching hospital, right? That you have senior people, you have junior people coming in, and how do they interact? You have somebody who has 30 years of experience and 3 years of experience. How do you get them to meld and learn from each other? And so much of our work is repeat relationships, that in order to develop that relationship with a client, it's about that kind of physical interaction. How do you get to know someone? And you can do it on a Zoom call, sure. But if you walk into a room, how do you read the room? How do you read the body posture? How do you talk, are they bored? Are they yawning? Sure, you can see that on Zoom. But it's that human interaction and it's eye contact that is really important. And I think some of that stuff, yes, it will evolve with technology, because it starts getting more real and real, right? Some of these experiences that we have in the digital world, but still it's that we're still humans, and we need that interaction. So I'm speaking more from the baby boomer edge. I am not a Gen Z by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's always interesting when you're speaking to someone and they don't have the eye contact. You don't know, are they listening? Are they put off by me? Do they like it? Like,
but those are interpretations, right? Like, those are generational differences.
They are.
I think a lot of times go untalked about, right? And I think that those are all things that you can create intentional learning opportunities around in your organization, right? Or as someone who is a senior leader, connecting greens and grays. Our team hosted a senior workshop day at Columbia for the interior design students, and all of their questions centered around that. They're like, I'm so eager, I'm so hungry, but I'm so nervous. How do I go into a room, and how do I network, and how do I find a mentor, and what is that relationship supposed to look like? And I think our organization does a lot of really intentional design around creating interactions that are meaningful and growth-oriented, and mentorship is a byproduct of that, right? Like, all the people that I've talked to over my, long professional journey in talent acquisition, there is a very common thread about forced mentorship that has a really negative undercurrent to it. It's not comfortable, it's not asked for, it's not engaging. There's nothing worse than being sat in a room with somebody that you're like uninspired by, forced to try to learn from, and be told that this is your mentor. I think it has the opposite effect. And so you can absolutely create a culture of mentorship without the connotation of, hey, Amanda and Lee, meet your mentor mentee, right? Like, you can
arrange marriage.
It's
like,
and there's benefits to that, right? Culture, but they don't, you don't always have to call it that, right? Like, it's just something that you can create organic opportunities for growth around, and you have to create a lot of those intentionally in your organizations, because you have no idea where your workforce is in their journey, right? Like, people learn differently, we interact differently, we want different things from those experiences, and it's never going to be a one-size-fits-all. So, mentorship, often works best when it's not
It's now.
labeled mentorship, right? You just create opportunity for connection and learning and growth in very intentional ways, and those mentor-mentee relationships are spawned out of those experiences, right?
Yeah, I want to build on that not one-size-fits-all idea, because I think that's a theme we've all come back to a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that ties into your point that, of course, there are scenarios where being in person makes the most sense, and you need those body cues, and you need to be face-to-face. But the frustrations I hear often revolve around the fact that it feels like we're, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Like, we're trying to solve this whole problem, this RTO problem, with one big solution.
Yeah.
Do you all see more personalization in the workplace as one of the ways forward? I don't know, anyone can build on that if you have thoughts.
Yeah, you have to meet people where they are, right? I'll go back to just like something that we talked about earlier around, how do you create these magnetic spaces? And it's by giving the constituents of that space a voice and empowering them to take ownership over what does this culture that I want to be a part of look like, and what makes it so great. I don't know. I think it is about that, right? I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all. I think that you have to give your organization a voice and quiet all the outside data and all the outside noise. There's so many narratives around return to office, like return to your own, right? Look into your organization and figure out what makes you a unique organization that people want to be a part of and belong to, and start there. Right? I don't think that, I think generally it can be that simple. And we're just in this place where we have so many things that can overcomplicate that. And it doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah. While we're talking about sort of designing a space that people do want to come to, I want to pass it over to Lee, because Gensler in LA actually redesigned their office post-pandemic to embrace sort of a new direction forward, shifting toward a look that almost mimics the home that maybe some employees got used to while being remote. And Lee has brought some photos that we can sort of check out to see what these conversations might actually look like in practice if you feel called to maybe change how your space actually looks.
Thanks, Grace. Yeah, I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of going through our process and experience. I also want to acknowledge Kirk in the audience. He's one of the project designers, so thanks for being here, Kirk. This is a process that we went through starting in March of 22. And so we work with our strategy group, and we had employee surveys, we did workshops, we kind of did analysis, brought in the data, we had different meetings, and then we started looking at what the vision is. And then we looked at what the opportunities came out of that. So it's like the topic of this is, designing for the future. We had to, our space has to reflect the design that we do. We have to create innovative spaces in order to, bring people to the office. And we also wanted to commit to sustainable design. We know that the workspace evolves, and so are the people. It's really creating a variety of work settings, and also to support neurodiversity. We didn't really touch upon that, but it's such an important topic. Yeah. I think especially coming out of the pandemic and what that means, especially to the younger generations, how they experienced the shutdown in education and socially, and how they had to fall back on the digital self, and how that will affect the workplace. And I think that's something that will be coming online, and it's starting to now, and that will continue to evolve. And then it's most importantly is to support the choice of where you work, and we have very diverse work styles. So how do you support that? Again, it's not one size fits all. So we're calling this the pilot project. We did one floor in downtown LA. And these were some of the additional visions that we focused on some of the solutions. We didn't have assigned seating before we had assigned seating, so now we do desk sharing. So some of the data showed that pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, we were in the office 65 to 70%. That people were out at meetings, they were on vacation, they were at job sites. And so why do we have all this extra desks that aren't being used? So that space was transferred to more shared spaces that people could work, and it gives a variety of work modes that people can have a selection from. And then the aesthetics, it was kind of creating that lifestyle look. We refreshed our palette with warmer tones. We have conference rooms with lounge seatings now. That's like a new vocabulary. Yes, we are behind. But it's an elevated design look, and there's some areas that are more informal, which makes people feel more relaxed. And again, it gives you the different comfort and also reflection on wellness. So what makes you feel good in a physical work day?
Yeah.
And then lastly, it's technology is such an important component, in our lives, how we communicate with ourselves and with our clients. And so just having that at the fingertips, and this is still evolving. I believe it will continue to evolve. I mean, it's never perfected. And then how do you improve that hybrid work? Because we know we do have a policy of 5 days a week, but that we need flexibility, in the workspace. So these are some of the results. So the top right is the before, where it felt more like a call center, where we had, the rows and rows of sit-stand desks, the monitors, and it was physically really a black and white space. And the bottom, the bottom right is actually the workspace, where we have a variety, again, of settings, different desk styles, which could be more communal or more enclosed. We have these pods. We're just on our second revision of coming into a semi-enclosed pod that sit-stand, beautiful lighting, whether you're on Zoom or just working on your screen. And the acoustics give you privacy, so you can hear about what's going on, because we're very team focused, and it's very important to understand the activities during the day. But it still gives you that focus time, which is so critical. Because I think that's one of the biggest complaints is the noise in the space. How do you control the noise? And then the balance of the space is looking at some of our lounges, again, sofas and communal tables and a banquette. So again, the variety of seating. And it's fun. It's fun working with project teams. It's fun presenting to clients. They're sitting on a sofa. We can serve lunch, or we can sit at the community table, look at palettes, and have some really, really great in-person interactions. So, and we've seen attendance increase up to 35% in some of the studios in our office. So, the message we wanted to convey is that design matters. The quality of spaces really matter. And again, we kind of had the luxury of a year of listening and learning, and that's not typically normal, but that was a very important step that you have to start at, and it's an important step of the process to get a really effective solution.
Yeah, no, this looks like a chic apartment instead of what I would think of as an office. I would definitely come to work here.
You're welcome anytime.
Oh, great. Just hop on a plane. I'm curious, what kind of road bumps did you come into after implementing this, since it's such a major overhaul?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that, because we just finished a standalone building, which we call our jewel box. It's kind of our main office space, and it's 3 levels. So this was a pilot. It was 1 floor in the tower adjacent, which we connect with a bridge. And we learned technology is super important. We got frustrated a lot, which a lot of situations wasn't plug and play. So it was perfecting that. We've also incorporated in some of our conference rooms It sounds simple, but multi-monitors. You have a monitor at the front and at the side. If a client's on the monitor at the front, I can be presenting to the side, and it's interactive. I can work off my Miro board. I can sketch up, and it's real life. And then there's people at the table too. So the client on the screen, if they're in Hong Kong or wherever, they can see the room and participate in the process. And it's real time. So you're presenting, you're exchanging ideas, you're showing alternates, and you're coming to some conclusions so you can move on. So those are some of the lessons that we learned. And then you would think, our work is all digital, but we have so much material. So storage, again, is very important, and some of the groups were short-sighted on that. So we're trying to figure out different solutions always on that part.
Do you guys have any questions for Lee? I'm curious if this brings anything up for either of you.
My only comment was they have a beautiful Chicago office as well. So we'll go meet up and co-work in the
great.
Gensler Chicago.
Yeah,
It doesn't quite look like this, but it's beautiful as well.
Perfect. Well, I love that example. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think just to steer us sort of forward into what we can expect going, in the future from here, do you guys have any thoughts on what the future of the workplace might look like? Let's say 10 years from now, what might be different? I know we've talked a little bit about how we handle our time, the space itself, just anything that comes to mind when I say that.
I'll go. I mean, I think it's just been really enlightening to hear all the different conversations this week in industry and out of industry, but the future of work is flexibility, right? I think it's multimodal, right? We think about that in so many different ways. I have a friend who works for a technology company, and I think Joey Shimoda had mentioned it earlier today, that in the future, we're going to be able to engage AI as a part of our team, physical robots or people that we can tap on the shoulder and bring into our spaces. And I think that has to be accounted for, right? So we're trying to plan for something that we can't see yet, but I think there's a company that's a client of ours that talks about that in terms of elastic thinking, right? Elastic spaces and elastic thinking, and being able to plan for something that you don't have the data to plan for, right? So I think flexibility, both in physical space, which, there's no coincidence that comfort shows up as a keyword and feels like a cozy place to be. I think it's adaptability to flexibility is the organizations of the future that are going to be the most successful.
Agreed. And I love that you brought AI into this. I think it's just a really of the moment conversation, a bit maybe overhyped right now, and I think overhyped in a fear cycle. So if anyone's interested, we have a great episode of Design Nerds Anonymous, the podcast that I'm representing here, but where we interview a man named Phil Kirshner. I don't know if anybody follows him on LinkedIn. Definitely kind of bucking the norms, bucking the way things have always been done, and Microsoft. And they talk a lot about the future of work and how, if we let it, how AI might be able to kind of help match our needs, maybe your needs for the day with that flexibility, maybe your schedule with children and childcare and some of the underrepresented groups that you talked about. But a lot of it comes down to, as you hear about that episode, a lot of it really comes down to what we're willing to give up and how much we trust AI. And I think that's really interesting, as I started my first piece talking about this trust gap that's growing. And I think that trust gap is going to get bigger with AI coming into the workplace. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what personal information we're willing to give up to make AI a coworker. And that is going to have a big effect on, I think, even physical workspaces and how we design them. Because I think that's one of my cautions about the return to office terminology, is that we can't get so excited about returning to something that we miss the opportunities in between. Maybe regional offices where people that live in certain suburb area could meet up, the revitalized co-working. Think about how many of us are working in hotel rooms, and okay, are hotel rooms yet designed for those of us that try to be on Zoom? No, you're like showing the bed behind you and the lighting is just terrible. It's just awful. You feel like you have to apologize to who you're talking about. So I would just encourage us to not get so excited about returning that we miss some of the opportunities in between, because those are beautiful opportunities for design as well.
Yeah, I think those are great thoughts, and it's important that workplace stays nimble, that the workspace constantly needs to evolve. At move-in, it's move-in, but you have to have the mindset that it needs to change, with the work, with the workforce. And design matters, like the whole design experience really matters in the environment and how people interact. And also sustainable design is very important on that effort, and how we treat the physical workspace. And I think we have a very bright future.
That's great. Yeah, I think my key takeaway today is just that we can expect to move from this maybe more rigid understanding to something more flexible, personalized, not a one-size-fits-all. And it's been lovely chatting with you all. I appreciate all of you for coming. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Grace.
Thank you, Grace.